We were due to have Sue Hill giving the next talk. Unfortunately, Sue is not well, and we wish her a speedy recovery. But Sue's been good enough to send some slides through. So I'm going to present those slides. These are Sue's slides that I'm going to present. So please bear with me. I won't be as fluent as Sue at delivering this, but I think it is important for me to show the kind of things which NHS England are doing. You've heard the kind of fantastic science investment that's come from MRC plus other funders. But unless there are parallel developments in the way we deliver clinical care in the NHS, that kind of investment in research will not be matched in terms of how we can transform clinical services as quickly as possible. It will always lag behind. So the kind of things which are going on in NHS England are very, very important. And you know, Sue Hill, working with Genomics England, has been transformational in driving those kind of changes which are occurring. So what I want to do is to tell you about, first of all, how NHS England is developing a genomic medicine service and how that is also then going to lead to much more personalised medicine and the personalised medicine strategy for NHS England. So if you look at the UK, there's been, in terms of genomics in the NHS, there's been quite a lot of investment over the years. There have been NHS genetics laboratories since the 1960s, and then the investment from government, and then there have been various white papers, for example, the NHS genetics white paper, etc., and various other things which have come through from government and various other bodies. And this then led on to the Human Genetics Strategy Group, which John Bell chaired in 2012. And that really was the forerunner to developing the 100,000 Genomes Project. More recently, Sally Davis produced a report, the CMO's report in 2017, which was on Generation Genome, which covered many different areas, including the kind of stratified medicine approaches as well. And obviously what has been transformational has been the 100,000 Genomes Project, which is recruiting reached over 50,000 genomes a couple of weeks ago. Amazing milestone already, and they're going to hopefully finish off all the genomes within the next year or so. And then John Bell's life science strategy, where genomics is central to that life science strategy in terms of driving things forward for genomic medicine in the UK. And clearly we want to do this because we want to be able to develop better diagnosis, earlier diagnosis, preventive approaches, personalized approaches, etc., and improved outcomes, finally, for our patients, as well as increasing wealth through industry interactions. So the NHS Genomic Medicine Service and the aim of Sue and her team at NHS England is to really develop a service which provides testing availability for 55 million people in England in a consistent and equitable manner. It's important that this doesn't become a facility for the rich. It doesn't introduce health inequalities. It's got to, because it's so complicated, whole genome sequencing, etc., it's got to have common standards, and that's going to be very important. The other aspect is also to have a genetic testing directory, which is then available to everybody, and you can then see what you're ordering and what kind of tests are going to be done. And clearly, you're going to develop enormous amount of data from this, particularly from whole genome sequencing. We won't know what it all means at the beginning, so you need to put it into a directory, a database, which allows for future research, but also allows for future clinical trial recruitment and development of new tests in a streamlined fashion. So the idea behind the Genomic Medicine Service is really integrating everything across the whole system, according to the team at NHS England. And key with that is that what you need is quality. And because of the complexity of the genomic testing that's got to be done, there's got to be quality assurance of that. You've got to have a skilled workforce, and what Health Education England are doing at the moment in terms of educating the workforce and other things which are going on are going to be extremely important. Underpinning that, and John has already mentioned that, is the informatics capabilities that will be developed. And finally, that will lead to more efficiency and savings in terms of money, etc., for the future. make it much more cost efficient as well as time efficient is the aim. Clearly what we have at the moment in the UK are different genetics laboratories. Sometimes they're quite small and quite dispersed, and clinical genetic services as well as genomic medicine centres. And what the current vision is that these all come together into genomic laboratory hubs, 7 throughout England, which will allow NHS England to be able to deliver the genomic service, ensuring comprehensive coverage. We are working towards an approved genomic testing directory, with integration of the clinical genetic service to provide specialist advice, counselling, etc. But really, this will drive forward the mainstreaming of genomic medicine into the NHS. And that's critical. We've got to be able to do that for the benefit of our patients. And really then driving medicines optimization. We are faced with polypharmacy. The NHS England, the NHS budget for medicines is £18 billion a year. Many patients that I see in my clinic are on 15, 16 medicines. And we need to be able to think of how we can actually improve that to improve outcomes from the medicines that we use. The building blocks are already there. And there's been a lot of work going on and more work which will go on over the next few years. Clearly, what we have are huge advances in genomics, informatics technologies, as John has already told you about. But the workforce development is going on at the moment with Health Education England. And clearly, core to this is multidisciplinary, and the partnerships between industry, academia, and the international partnerships are going to be crucial in terms of driving this forward. What we also have is what Genomics England has been doing in this country, developing the informatics architecture, the data storage, which is at the Sanger, and the clinical interpretation pipeline, working with partners within Genomics England, and obviously the whole genome sequencing provision that has already happened in 100,000 Genomes project, and which will then be taken into clinical service delivery. And what will happen from that is this integration of the genomic services, clinical testing services within the UK with these new 7 genomic laboratory hubs and the national testing strategy, leading to a 21st century service for NHS England. The procurement is already happening. It's currently live. And the mobilization of what's going to happen in terms of the service will be later on this year. So it's a very ambitious timeline, and it will be operational from later on this year. So somebody asked me earlier on at tea, when will all this be operational? Well, later on this year. And that's fantastic news. So a genomic testing directory is very important. Clearly, what we have already available are different kinds of genetic tests. But for the future genetic testing service, we may have single gene to whole genome sequencing, more than 300,000 tests per year at the moment, and that's likely to increase, and that's important. What we will have is a kind of common flow clinical pathway where you have a particular referral, a diagnosis made, you get the DNA, you then send it to the hubs where you actually have testing done either by a gene panel or whole genome sequencing or particular wet lab tests as well. And it all goes into an NHS data warehouse, a reporting portal, and your data flows not only between that reporting portal plus various other aspects, but also to the clinician who ordered it in an interpretable manner that can be then relayed to the patient so that appropriate treatment, appropriate diagnosis can be made. And that's hugely important in terms of how things will move in the future. Important aspects of this particular infrastructure which is being developed is that data on outcomes and testing will be collected. Also, it's expected that 25% of all the testing will be replaced by newer technologies as we move along within this infrastructure. And again, that is important in terms of what's coming next for NHS England. So here's the test directory that they're working towards, and the technologies and the reporting of that particular test directory. And at the moment, you can see on that table, on the slide, there are 22 technology categories there. So if there's a particular thing that needs to be done, disease that needs to be tested, it doesn't necessarily mean there will be whole genome sequencing, but it could be whole genome sequencing, particularly for cancers and other rare diseases where you don't have a diagnosis and there's diagnostic odyssey. But it could actually be a genetic testing panel, or it could be single gene tests. And all of these different tests are likely to be available within these genomic hubs, which is very important in terms of taking it forward for the future and improving the pathology services, streamlining the pathology services, streamlining genomic medicine into the NHS and making things work for our patients. So once you've got that genomic medicine service, then you can start thinking about how you can personalize with all the sort of things which are coming through from the research which has been funded from many different funders and what you'll hear about today. And that's going to be very important. What we forget about is that we often do research, we do the clinical trials, fantastic clinical trials, but the key issue in terms of diffusion and uptake in the NHS is sometimes there's no implementation infrastructure. But this kind of service that's being developed allows the development of that implementation infrastructure, which allows earlier diffusion and uptake within the NHS, which is important for the patients. It's important for our industry partners to see that there is a clear pathway for taking things up into the NHS. And what we have are lots of building blocks on one part of the slide that you can see that really allow us to have the technology available. There's a need for this, unmet need for this at the moment. We have the leadership associated with driving this forward. We have the informatics capabilities associated with this. And this will all help us take forward the concept of personalizing medicines. For many areas, initially it will be cancer, initially it will be rare disease areas, but also it will then progress into other areas, inflammatory diseases, hugely important, psychiatry diseases, etc., and drug safety areas as well. And what will happen, hopefully, in the future is that you will have transformation of the clinical care pathways through patient characterization, stratification, which may be due to symptoms, as in psychiatry that John mentioned, or it could be related to stratification through the omic tests, which are going to be delivered through the kind of research and pathways which are being set up at the moment. So really the personalization journey, where we're at the moment and the future looks like this within the NHS England vision for delivering personalized medicine. Clearly we have some specific examples at the moment which are already being delivered within the NHS, largely due to rare diseases for diagnosis and for cancer, plus some other kind of HLA typing which is done for some rare adverse events. But the 100,000 Genomes Project obviously is transforming things and developing new diagnostic assays, new diagnostic tests already. And then as we move on from this year, what we'll have is genomic medicine embedded within specific pathways through the reconfiguration that's going on of the genomic labs at the moment. And what we have are all the infrastructure that's available, data analytics, etc., phenotypic characterization, which allows the development of the personalized pathways. And really, if you look at the personalization pathways, what we hopefully should aim for is earlier diagnosis. At the moment, there are many people with rare diseases who do not have a diagnosis, and they go through many different specialists, have many different investigations done, and there's a diagnostic odyssey. Yet a whole genome sequence done for about 700 or 800 quid will be able to tell them the diagnosis, which will be important for the families, getting earlier diagnosis, but important also in terms of treatment as well. Importantly, greater diagnostic yield. Much more so in terms of cancer particularly, where you can get actionable genes and hopefully therapeutic advances which come from that. More precise diagnosis. At the moment, we often diagnose diseases on the basis of phenotype developed in the late 19th, early 20th century, and more precise diagnosis, which allows stratification, will allow for better treatment and treatment pathways as well. Obviously, more effective treatments which will come out of this as well, and BCR-ABL, that John mentioned, imatinib, is one example. There are many other examples, particularly in the cancer area, of new drugs, but also in cystic fibrosis, where molecular diagnosis has eventually led to the development of ivacaftor and other precise treatments which are now utilized. A clear aspect, which particularly interests me because of my area, is fewer adverse effects. There's a huge burden of adverse effects in the NHS, and we need to be able to tackle that as well through using genomic services. The important aspect as well is that we don't have all the answers at the moment. This needs to feed into clinical research. And having that data And having that kind of resource of patients who have been genotyped allows us to be able to undertake stratified clinical trials much more effectively than we can do at the moment. If you recruit 2,000 patients, the chances of you getting a positive result from a drug trial is going to be pretty slim, and the effect size is going to be quite small because you have a lot of heterogeneity in that particular population. But if you can stratify your populations according to genetics and then take that forward in terms of clinical trials, you may get a much larger effect size for a stratified population, and that database will help us to be able to achieve that. And clearly, in the end, all that the personalization that's leading there will be lead to better prognostic approaches and better preventive approaches. And the imatinib story in terms of prevention of disease is an example of that as well. So today, at the moment, we are here in terms of variable patient access to genetic technologies. There are some things which are already in the NHS. By 2020, we will have the National Genomic Medicine Service incorporated within NHS England and hopefully the other sort of NHS bodies in the devolved nations as well, which will, I'm sure, will be working with NHS England in terms of delivering similar services within their own nations. Improved diagnosis of rare conditions, cancer, etc. Improved integrated platforms for data and linked up to the omics, biobanks and so on, which is going to be hugely important, and clearly disruption of clinical pathways. You do need to disrupt clinical pathways, and that may not be particularly popular within the sort of at the coalface in terms of people working in particular clinics and so on, but really those disruptive clinical pathways will eventually lead to benefits in terms of patient outcomes and efficiency in clinics as well eventually through the better outcomes. By 2025, according to the vision NHS England have, is that we will have a new taxonomy of disease, and that's already happening. You may have seen data a month or so ago from a Danish group showing that they've tried to stratify diabetes on the basis of clinical data, electronic health record data through the Danish kind of informatics banks that they have. Routine use of whole human genome sequencing in 2025 and newer genomic technologies incorporated with the multiple clinical pathways. And genomics seen as a fundamental part of clinical training across all professions and leads. We don't teach our medical students, pharmacy students enough about genomics. The curricula will have to change. More importantly, we have a huge workforce out there at the moment which has never had any genomics education, and they need to be educated as well and trained in genomics, and that CPD, etc., that's going to occur is going to be hugely important in terms of delivery of the pathways. And clearly the ultimate aim is to have tailored, optimized, more effective therapies for better outcomes. So one of the things that NHS England are also looking at the moment is the pharmacogenomics area, which is pharmacogenomics, as you know, is one aspect of precision medicine, personalised medicine. And NHS England and Genomics England have established a work group, and there are various people in this room who are members of that working group, including myself. And what we've been doing is assessing the evidence on pharmacogenomics, identifying areas where there may be actionable findings, identify where implementation could really have the most value for the NHS and how we can actually start implementing that. And really, the key aspects that NHS England is looking at with regard to pharmacogenomics is where should it focus its effort of the next 2, 5, 10 years, and as things develop and as new things come into place, it's going to be important that this is a dynamic pathway that allows the development of this kind of testing. Obviously, value is very important with regard to what NHS England does in terms of delivering pharmacogenomics and genomic medicine to the NHS, and sustainability, equity of access are hugely important. Clearly, practical issues are always going to be important in any area. In this area particularly, pharmacogenomics, but also precision medicine is ability to interpret. Who has the knowledge out there at the coalface in terms of interpreting some of these very, very complicated tests? And so what we'll need to be developed in parallel are the clinical decision support systems, so that people can understand what the test means, how to interpret it, and what action to take in order to make sure the patient gets the right treatment across the way. In order to be able to help the decision-making within the pharmacogenomics sphere, particularly, and with this working group. We held a workshop, as I said earlier this year, 21st February, which we had speakers from the United States, from Europe, as well as the UK, showing what's going on at the moment in other countries, in Europe as well, particularly in the United States, in terms of implementation and what we can learn from that, as well as where the sort of infrastructure is at the moment in the UK. And hopefully this particular workshop will inform the workings of the pharmacogenomics working group in terms of trying to drive implementation into the NHS. So that's Sue's slides. I hope I presented them clearly and accurately. And I'm happy to take questions. If I can't answer them, I'll pass them on to Sue, and I'm sure she'll answer them in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.